The letter that changed everything for Sarah Jenkins arrived on the day she was evicted, the same day her son's fever spiked to a dangerous 104 degrees. It informed her that a great uncle she'd never met had left her his entire estate, a derelict fish cannery in the frozen north of Alaska. Before we find out what was waiting for Sarah in that icy wasteland, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far these stories travel. Now, back to the biting wind and the letter that felt less like a lifeline and more like a cruel joke. The eviction notice was a brutalist piece of paper, stark white against the peeling brown paint of the apartment door. Its black, impersonal font, a declaration of war she had already lost. It felt heavier than paper ought to, weighted with the finality of deadlines and the cold indifference of legal process. Sarah had read it a dozen times, her eyes tracing the same cruel words until they blurred into meaningless shapes. The landlord, a man whose face she barely knew, had been patient for a month, then understanding for a week, and then suddenly finished. The world didn't run on understanding. It ran on rent, and hers was 3 months past due. Inside the cramped one-bedroom apartment, the air was thick with the scent of sickness and despair. Leo, her 6-year-old son, lay on the threadbare couch, his small body radiating a heat that terrified her. His breaths were shallow, rattling in his chest like loose stones. The cough that had started as a minor annoyance a week ago had deepened into something cavernous and raw. His face, usually a constellation of freckles and mischief, was pale and slick with sweat, his eyes glassy and unfocused. She'd given him the last of the children's fever reducer that morning, a sticky pink liquid that he'd barely managed to swallow. It hadn't touched the fever. The eviction notice was a death sentence for their stability, but Leo's fever felt like a threat to everything. The two crises had converged into a perfect storm of hopelessness. Boxes, half-packed and sagging, littered the floor like defeated soldiers. They held the sum total of their life. Mismatched plates, worn-out clothes, a handful of Leo's carefully guarded plastic dinosaurs, in a small library of children's books with soft, frayed corners. There was nowhere to go. The shelter was full, a fact delivered with practiced apathy over the phone. Her friends, the few she had, were themselves clinging to the frayed edges of solvency, their own apartments already crowded with family. There was no safety net, just the hard, unforgiving pavement of a city that had no room for them. It was in this moment, as she was pressing a cool, damp cloth to Leo's forehead, that the mail carrier slid the day's offerings through the slot in the door. A final utility bill, a flyer for a pizza place they could never afford, and a thick cream-colored envelope. It felt incongruous, an artifact from a different world. The return address was a law firm in Anchorage, Alaska, a place she knew only from nature documentaries and frozen maps. The name on the letterhead, .0, meant nothing to her. She slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife, her hands trembling slightly, not with anticipation, but with the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. The language was dense, legalistic, but the core message was shockingly clear. Alistair Finch, her mother's estranged uncle, a man she'd never known existed, had passed away. He had no other living relatives, and he had named her Sarah Marie Jenkins as the sole heir to his entire estate. The estate consisted of one primary asset, the .1 located in Point Hope, Alaska. The letter concluded with instructions to contact the law firm to arrange the transfer of title, and enclosed was a one-way bus ticket to Anchorage and a cashier's check for $500 for transitional expenses. Sarah stared at the ticket, then at the check, then back at the letter. It was absurd, a joke, a mistake, a fish cannery in Alaska. What was she supposed to do with a derelict building at the edge of the world? It was a burden, not a blessing. Another problem to solve when she couldn't even solve the one burning with fever on her couch. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to dismiss it as another complication in a life overflowing with them. But then she looked at Leo, his small hand twitched in his sleep, reaching for her. The $500? It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than she'd held at one time in over a year. It could buy a motel room for a week. It could buy more medicine, better food. It could buy time. But the ticket, The ticket was a door to an unknown darkness, to leave the familiar misery of the city for a completely alien one, to take her sick child on a multi-day bus journey into the frozen wilderness based on the promise of a dead man she'd never met. It was insane, and yet what was the alternative? The street, a shelter, if one opened up. Leo getting sicker in the back of a bus station. The choice wasn't between a good option and a bad one. It was between a terrifying certainty and a terrifying unknown. The sound of the landlord's heavy footsteps on the stairs outside made the decision for her. He knocked once, a hard, impatient rap of knuckles on wood. "Sarah, sheriff will be here in an hour. I want you out." His voice was muffled but clear, stripped of all previous pretense of sympathy. It was the voice of a man doing a job. The finality of it echoed in the small room. An hour. Sarah looked at the eviction notice, at her son, and at the ticket to Alaska. The cannery might be a ruin. The inheritance might be a debt. The entire thing might be a cruel cosmic prank, but it was a direction. It was a place to go. And right now, that was more than she had. She tucked the check and the letter into her pocket, the crisp paper a strange anchor in the chaos. She knelt beside Leo, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "Leo, baby," she whispered, stroking his damp hair. "We're going on an adventure, a long trip, to a cold place." He stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment, clouded with fever. "Dinosaurs," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Will there be snow dinosaurs?" A tear escaped her eye, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "Maybe, sweetie," she lied, her voice catching. "Maybe we'll find whole mountains of them." She packed their single remaining suitcase with a grim, desperate efficiency. Clothes, medicine, and the plastic T-Rex that Leo couldn't sleep without. The rest, the boxes, the furniture, the life she had tried to build, she left behind. It was all just dead weight now. As she walked out of the apartment for the last time, carrying her sleeping son in one arm and their suitcase in the other, she didn't look back. The city behind her was a place of ghosts and failures. Ahead lay only the vexed, white, terrifying unknown of Alaska. The journey north was a descent into a different kind of poverty, one measured not in dollars but in degrees of temperature and miles of unforgiving emptiness. The bus, a rumbling, diesel-fumed vessel, carried them out of the familiar urban sprawl and into the heart of a continent that grew wilder and more desolate with every passing hour. For 3 days, Sarah and Leo lived in a state of suspended animation. The world outside the grimy window transformed from concrete and steel to endless forests of pine and spruce, then to vast, rolling tundra that seemed to stretch into eternity. The sun became a pale, distant disk, offering little light and even less warmth. Leo's fever waxed and waned. In his lucid moments, he pressed his face against the cold glass, his breath fogging a small circle as he watched the alien landscape slide by. He was quiet, his usual boisterous energy stolen by the illness, but his eyes were wide with a kind of subdued wonder. Sarah spent the hours in a haze of anxiety, her mind a frantic loop of worst-case scenarios. She rationed the $500 with monastic discipline, buying bland sandwiches and bottled water at desolate bus stations that all smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. She counted every penny, knowing it had to last until she could make sense of the incomprehensible inheritance waiting for them at the end of the line. She felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, the weary truckers, the transient workers, the families moving from one precarious life to another. She saw in their faces the same exhaustion she felt in her bones, the same quiet desperation. They were all running from something or to something, and the distinction was often blurred. Anchorage was not the promised land. It was a city clinging to the edge of a wilderness, its streets a grid of practicality laid over a landscape of raw, untamed power. Mountains, jagged and white, loomed over the city like ancient, slumbering gods. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, a physical presence that stole her breath. The law office was in a squat, modern building that seemed out of place amidst the ruggedness of its surroundings. Inside, a man named Mr. Abernathy, a partner in the firm, greeted her with a handshake that was both firm and dismissive. He was in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes that seemed to assess her and find her wanting in a single glance. He spoke of her great-uncle Alistair as a known eccentric, a recluse amongst. The words hung in the air, a polite way of calling him a madman. The paperwork was signed with a cheap pen that Abernathy provided. Sarah's signature, small and hesitant, transferred ownership of the Point Hope fish cannery to her name. It felt unreal, like a scene from a movie she was watching, not a life she was living. The property has been dormant for nearly 20 years, Abernathy said, steepling his fingers. The taxes are considerable, and they are now your responsibility. Frankly, Ms. Jenkins, the land might be worth something to a development company, but the structure itself is a liability. He offered no help, no advice, only a folder of documents and a key. A single, heavily rusted iron key. There's a charter flight to Point Hope in the morning, he added as she was leaving. We've taken the liberty of booking you a seat. The cost has been deducted from the remainder of your transitional funds. He said it as if he had done her a great favor. The flight was on a tiny propeller plane that felt like it was held together with sheer willpower. It bucked and shuddered in the wind, and through the small porthole, Sarah saw nothing but an endless expanse of white. The land below was a frozen, featureless sea, broken only by the dark, jagged lines of frozen rivers. There was no color, only shades of white and gray and black. It was the most isolating landscape she had ever seen. Point Hope was not a town. It was a scattering of buildings huddled against the shore of the Chukchi Sea, as if for warmth. The wind was a constant, keening presence, a physical force that scoured the land and drove ice and snow into every crack and crevice. There was no welcome sign, no gentle introduction. There was only the brutal, shocking cold and the immense, crushing silence of the Arctic. A man was waiting for them on the gravel runway. He was Inuit, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles carved by a lifetime of sun and wind. He was wrapped in thick furs and introduced himself as Silas. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. "You are the Finch woman," he said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her, then at Leo, who was shivering in her arms, and a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or concern, crossed his face. He led them to an old, beaten-up snowmobile with a small sled attached. The ride to the cannery was a journey through a frozen ghost town. The buildings were low and functional, their windows dark. There were no trees, no grass, nothing to soften the hard edges of the world. The cannery stood at the edge of the settlement, a colossal skeletal structure looming against the gray sky. It was larger than she had imagined, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings, its corrugated metal walls stained deep red with rust. It looked like the carcass of some great metal beast that had washed ashore and died. The wind howled through its broken windows, creating a mournful, flute-like sound. Quote 17, Silas said, his voice almost lost in the wind. Kutkan, he handed her the key Abernathy had given her. It felt cold and useless in his gloved hand. The main gate was chained shut, the lock frozen solid. Silas produced a heavy set of bolt cutters and snapped the chain with a sharp crack that echoed in the frozen air. He pushed the gate open, its hinges groaning in protest. The courtyard was a graveyard of industrial decay. Rusted drums, tangled piles of fishing nets stiff with ice, and the skeletal remains of old machinery lay half-buried in drifting snow. The place smelled of out, rust, and a deep, abiding loneliness. Silas led her to a smaller door on the side of the main processing building. Quote 19, he said, pointing to a small office on the second floor. Quote 20, he looked at her again, his dark eyes searching her face. Quote 20, he paused, his gaze sweeping over the derelict factory. Quote 20, with that cryptic warning, he turned to leave. Quote 23, Sarah called out, her voice thin against the wind. Quote 24, Silas stopped and looked back, a long, contemplative silence stretching between them. Quote 25, he said, finally. Quote 26, he gestured toward a small, insulated shed near the main building. Quote 27, he revved the engine of his snowmobile and disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving Sarah and Leo alone at the gate of their new, terrifying inheritance. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. The rusted iron key felt like a relic from a forgotten age in Sarah's numb fingers. It slid into the lock of the side door with a grating shriek of metal on metal, a sound that seemed to protest her very presence. The door resisted, swollen with ice and disuse, but with a desperate shove of her shoulder it groaned open, revealing a darkness that felt colder than the air outside. The stench that rolled out was a complex and ancient perfume of decay, the sharp brine of the sea, in the metallic tang of rust, the faint phantom smell of fish, and an underlying musk of damp, cold earth. It was the smell of a place that time had abandoned. Holding Leo's small hand tightly in hers, Sarah stepped across the threshold, leaving the gray half-light of the Arctic day for the tomb-like blackness of the Cannery. The door swung shut behind them with a deep, resonant boom that echoed through the cavernous space, sealing them inside. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own breathing and the relentless, mournful song of the wind whistling through the building's countless wounds. Sarah fumbled in her bag for the small, cheap flashlight she'd bought in Anchorage. Its beam cut a weak, trembling circle in the oppressive dark, illuminating a world of industrial ghosts. They were in what must have been a changing room or a small entryway. Rusted lockers stood against one wall like silent sentinels, their doors hanging open at odd angles. A calendar from 1998 was still tacked to a corkboard, its picture of a cheerful cartoon salmon faded and curled. A set of metal stairs led upward into more darkness. Leo whispered, his voice small and tight, his grip on her hand like a vice, his breath plumed in the flashlight's beam. Quote 29, she said, her own voice lacking the conviction she was trying to project. Quote 30. The ascent up the stairs was slow and deliberate, each metal step groaning under their weight. The flashlight beam danced ahead of them, revealing glimpses of a vast, open space on the main floor below, the processing room. She could just make out the hulking, silent shapes of machinery, conveyor belts, gutting tables, and massive vats, all shrouded in cobwebs thick as cotton and a fine layer of frozen dust. It was a factory frozen in mid-motion, as if the workers had simply vanished 20 years ago. The office was at the top of the stairs, its door marked with a faded, hand-painted sign that read, quote, 31, quote. The lock on this door was newer, and the key turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. Inside, the space was a stark contrast to the decay around it. It was small and Spartan, but it was clean, almost meticulously so. A heavy wooden desk stood against one wall, a simple cot against the other. A pot-bellied stove was in the corner, a neat stack of firewood beside it. A wall of shelves was filled not with business ledgers, but with books, thick volumes of botany, marine biology, history, and philosophy. It was the room of a scholar, not a fishmonger. This had been Alistair's home. Hope, fragile but fierce, flickered in Sarah's chest. This was survivable. This was a sanctuary. Her first priority was the generator. Following Silas's directions, she left Leo wrapped in every blanket she had on the cot and ventured back out into the biting wind. The generator shed was a short walk from the main building. Inside, a massive diesel generator sat silent and cold. The fuel tank was miraculously half full. She found the instruction panel, her frozen fingers fumbling with the switches. She prayed to a god she wasn't sure she believed in, and pulled the starter. The machine sputtered, coughed a plume of black smoke, and then, with a deafening roar, it shuddered to life. Back in the office, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered and then cast a steady, yellow glow. The light felt like a miracle. An electric heater in the corner hummed to life, its coils beginning to glow a dull, beautiful orange. Sarah felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. They had light. They had heat. They had shelter. For the first time since the eviction notice appeared on her door, she felt a sliver of control. As the small room slowly began to shed its bone-deep chill, she turned her attention to her great-uncle's desk. It was orderly, almost obsessively so. In the top drawer, she found a collection of journals, bound in worn black leather. The first entry was dated almost 30 years ago, the last one just a few months before his death. The handwriting was a dense, spidery script filled with technical observations about ocean currents, fish populations, and weather patterns. But as she skimmed through the pages, she found other entries, more personal and cryptic. He wrote of a quote 32 of a world quote 33. He mentioned a project, his quote 34, which he referred to only as quote 35. One phrase was underlined several times in a later journal. Quote 36, it was the rambling of a man obsessed, but there was a strange, urgent clarity to his words. As Leo slept, his breathing finally easing in the warmth of the room, Sarah spent hours reading. She learned about her great-uncle not as a person, but as a mind. He was a man who saw the world in systems, in long, slow cycles of growth and decay. He believed humanity was on a collision course with catastrophe, a crisis of its own making. The cannery, she began to realize, was not just a business to him. It was a tool, a fortress, a laboratory. She found maps of the cannery complex, detailed blueprints that showed not just the main processing floor in the offices, but vast subterranean levels she hadn't known existed. The largest of these was labeled simply Cold Storage Vault. A thick red line was drawn around it, and in the margins, Alastair had written the heart of the matter, the anchor against the storm. That night, as the Arctic winds screamed outside their small pocket of warmth and light, Sarah fell asleep in a chair beside the cot, one of the journals open in her lap. She dreamed of vast, frozen rooms and strange, silent machinery. The cannery was no longer just a building, it was a mystery, and she and Leo were now standing at its very center. The inheritance was not a simple deed to a piece of property. It was a puzzle, left for her by a man she'd never met, and she had a growing, unsettling feeling that solving it would be the most important thing she would ever do. The weight of it was terrifying, but it was also the first time in a very long time that she had felt a sense of purpose beyond simple, desperate survival. The first few weeks were a brutal education in the realities of Arctic life. Survival was a full-time job, a relentless series of tasks dictated by the cold and the isolation. The generator became the beating heart of their existence, and keeping it fed with diesel, which Sarah had to purchase and haul from the small settlement, was a constant, back-breaking chore. Food was another challenge. The small store in Point Hope had a limited and expensive supply of non-perishables. Sarah learned to make their meager funds stretch, to create meals from canned beans and rice that were nourishing, if not inspiring. But amidst the hardship, there was a strange and unexpected peace. In the small, warm office, they were safe. Leo's health began to improve. The dry, cold air seemed to clear his lungs, and the persistent, rattling cough finally subsided. The fever broke and did not return. Color returned to his cheeks, and with it, his boundless, 6-year-old energy. He turned the vast, empty cannery into his personal kingdom. He raced his plastic dinosaurs down the silent conveyor belts and built forts from discarded crates in the cavernous packing rooms. For Leo, the ghost factory was not a place of decay, but of infinite possibility. His laughter, echoing through the cold, metal spaces, was a sound of life returning to a place that had been dead for decades. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her exploration of her great-uncle's legacy, both physical and intellectual. She spent her days methodically cleaning and organizing the office, and her nights poring over Alistair's journals. The man who emerged from the pages was complex and brilliant, a self-taught scientist with a poet's soul and a prophet's paranoia. He believed the world's delicate ecological balance was collapsing, and that the corporate and political powers that be were either too greedy or too short-sighted to stop it. Quote 39, he wrote in one entry. Quote from his obsession with, quote, one became clearer. It was not about preserving fish. It was about preserving a future he was certain was under threat. The cannery, with its industrial-grade freezing capacity and its remote defensible location, was the perfect vessel for his ark. The arrival of the man in the expensive parka was as sudden and jarring as a crack in the ice. He arrived not on a snowmobile, but in a sleek black helicopter that landed in the cannery's courtyard, its rotors kicking up a storm of snow and grit. He stepped out with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being in charge, his polished leather boots a stark contrast to the rust and grime of his surroundings. He introduced himself as Marcus Thorne, a representative from Arctic Sea Holdings, a multinational corporation with interests in fishing, shipping, and resource exploration. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never reached them. He didn't offer to shake her hand. "Miss Jenkins," he began, his voice smooth and cultured, a sound that was utterly alien in this place. "I'll be direct. We've been trying to acquire this property for some time. Your uncle was unwilling to negotiate. We're prepared to make you a generous offer to take this liability off your hands." He named a figure. It was more money than Sarah had ever imagined, enough to leave this frozen wasteland forever, to buy a small house, to give Leo a life of comfort and security. For a dizzying moment, she was tempted. The offer was a clean exit, a return to a world she understood. But then she thought of Alistair's journals, of his warnings about men just like this one. "Why do you want it?" she asked, her voice steady, surprising even herself. "The Cannery is a ruin." Thorne's smile tightened. "The location? It has strategic value. A deep water port, access to newly opened shipping lanes. The building itself is irrelevant. We'd demolish it, of course." Demolish it. The word landed like a blow. To destroy this place, Alistair's life's work, without even knowing what it truly was? To erase the mystery before it could be solved? "He wrote about you," Sarah said, thinking of a passage she'd read just the night before, where Alistair had railed against the corporate vultures who saw the Arctic not as a home or an ecosystem, but as a balance sheet. "He said you wanted to poison the well." Thorne's expression hardened, the mask of civility slipping for just a second. "Your uncle was a sentimental old fool, clinging to a world that no longer exists. This is a place of resources, Miss Jenkins, of opportunity, not sentiment. The offer is generous. It's also final. I suggest you consider it carefully." He handed her a business card, the embossed lettering cool and sharp against her skin. "I'll be in Anchorage for the week. You can reach me here." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned, climbed back into his helicopter, and was lifted away, leaving behind only the turbulent air and the lingering scent of jet fuel. The encounter left Sarah shaken, but also resolute. Thorne's dismissiveness, his undisguised contempt for her uncle, and his legacy had solidified her resolve. He hadn't seen a home, a sanctuary, or a mystery. He had seen only an obstacle to be removed. His offer wasn't a lifeline. It was a bribe to get her to abandon her post. That evening, she found what she was looking for in one of the Cannery blueprints. It was a detailed schematic of the cold storage vault, located directly beneath the main processing floor. Access was through a reinforced cargo elevator in a series of subterranean corridors. The vault itself was described as a Class 4 cryo-containment facility with walls of 3-foot-thick reinforced concrete and a multi-ton pressure-sealed door. This was the heart of the matter. This was what Alistair had been protecting. This was what Thorne, whether he knew it or not, was truly after. She knew then what she had to do. She had to get inside. She had to see what her great-uncle had deemed so important it was worth dedicating his life to preserving. The refusal to Thorne was not just a choice. It was her first true act of defiance, a declaration that she was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was the guardian of this place now. She was Alistair Finch's heir, in more than just name. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but for the first time, it felt less like a burden and more like a shield. The decision to open the vault was one thing. The reality of it was another. The blueprints showed the way, but the path was blocked by 2 decades of neglect and the unforgiving physics of the Arctic. The cargo elevator that led to the subterranean levels was dead, its machinery seized by rust and ice. The main power from the generator didn't extend to this part of the facility. The vault was a fortress, and she was on the outside with no army. For days, she studied the schematics, cross-referencing them with Alistair's journals. He had anticipated this. He had written about secondary power conduits and manual overrides, his notes a dense thicket of engineering jargon that she painstakingly deciphered. She learned about gears and relays, about hydraulic pressure and emergency cranks. The Cannery was teaching her a new language, one of mechanics and resilience. She needed help. Her first thought was Silas. She found him in the small community hall, mending a fishing net with practiced, patient hands. She laid the blueprints on the table in front of him. She told him about Thorne, about the journals, about her growing conviction that the Cannery held a secret of profound importance. Silas listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he simply traced the outline of the cold storage vault on the blueprint with a calloused finger. Quote 53. Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Bottom. He looked up from the plans and met her gaze. Guten quote Vaun. Sarah admitted the words of surrender and a plea. Quote 52. Silas nodded slowly. Quote Faram. The auxiliary generator was housed in its own concrete bunker behind the main cannery building, a structure she had assumed was for fuel storage. It was, as Silas had described, a beast, a diesel engine the size of a small truck, designed to keep the massive freezers running in the event of a power failure. It hadn't been started in 20 years. For the next week they worked. Silas, with his quiet, innate understanding of all things mechanical, became her mentor. He taught her how to clean fuel lines, how to check injectors, how to read the pressure gauges. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his hands, though gnarled with age, sure and steady. It was grueling work. The cold was a constant physical opponent, seeping through their layers of clothing, numbing their fingers and faces. They worked by the light of portable lanterns, their breath misting in the frigid air, the silence broken only by the scrape of metal and Silas's soft-spoken instructions. Sarah felt a transformation happening within herself. The helplessness that had defined her for so long was being replaced by a hard-won competence. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and stained with grease. She was learning the rhythms of the machine, the feel of a properly tightened bolt, the satisfying click of a circuit breaker resetting. It was more than just mechanical work. It was an act of reclamation. She was not just fixing a machine. She was rebuilding her own sense of agency. Leo often watched them from the doorway, a small, bundled figure with wide, curious eyes. He would bring them cups of hot broth, his small contribution to the monumental effort. He seemed to understand, in the way that children do, the importance of their task. The cannery was no longer just a spooky old building. It was a mission. Finally, the day came. Every line was checked, every fluid topped off. A new battery, sourced from Anchorage at great expense, was installed. This is it, Silas said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of tension. If it starts, it will shake the ground. Sarah took a deep breath, the icy air stinging her lungs. She turned the key. The starter motor groaned, a low, painful sound of protest from a long, slumbering giant. The engine turned over once, twice, then fell silent. Her heart sank. Again, Silas said, his hand on her shoulder. She tried again. The same groan, the same failure. Despair, cold and familiar, began to creep in. All this work for nothing. Once more, Silas urged, with feeling. Sarah closed her eyes, picturing the warm office, picturing Leo's smiling face. She poured all her hope, all her desperation, into that one motion. She turned the key and held it. The engine groaned, sputtered, caught, and then, with a deafening, cataclysmic roar, it exploded into life. The concrete floor beneath their feet vibrated with the raw power of it. A thick cloud of black smoke billowed from the exhaust stack, a signal of resurrection. Sarah and Silas looked at each other, their faces grimy, their eyes wide. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Silas's face. Lights flickered on all over the cannery complex, in buildings that had been dark for a generation. Down in the subterranean levels, the cargo elevator hummed, its indicator light glowing a steady, welcoming green. They had power. The path was open. The descent in the cargo elevator felt like a journey to the center of the earth. The air grew colder, denser, and the walls of the shaft were slick with a thin layer of ice. The elevator opened into a long concrete corridor, lit by bare, caged bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows. It was utterly silent, the roar of the generator a distant, muffled heartbeat. At the end of the corridor was the vault door. It was even more imposing than the blueprints had suggested. A perfect circle of polished steel, 10 feet in diameter, set into the concrete wall. A massive wheel, like that of a submarine hatch, was at its center. It was not locked with a key, but with a complex series of tumblers and pressure gauges. Alistair's notes had been precise. There was a sequence, a combination of pressure releases and wheel turns that had to be followed exactly. It took them an hour, their movements slow and careful, the silence amplifying the thud of their own hearts. With a final agonizing turn of the wheel, there was a deep hydraulic hiss, and a series of heavy clicks echoed from within the door's mechanism. The seal was broken. Sarah put her hands on the wheel. Silas placed his beside hers. Together, they pushed. The multi-ton door moved with a surprising silent grace, swinging inward to reveal the darkness beyond. A wave of air, unimaginably cold and pure, washed over them. It smelled of nothing, a perfect, sterile void. Sarah raised her lantern, its beam cutting through the blackness, and took her first step into the cold storage vault. The light from her lantern sliced through an atmosphere of absolute stillness. The air inside the vault was so cold it felt solid, a palpable presence that stole the breath from her lungs and crystallized it in a silver cloud before her face. The chamber was immense, far larger than she had conceived, stretching away into a darkness that her small light could not fully penetrate. It was less a room and more a cathedral dedicated to the cold. Rows upon rows of towering metal shelves, like library stacks in a strange frozen archive, filled the space. And on these shelves, illuminated in the dancing beam of her lantern, were not boxes of frozen fish, but thousands upon thousands of small, hermetically sealed containers. They were made of a dull gray metal, each one meticulously labeled with a code and a string of what looked like scientific names. Sarah walked slowly down one of the aisles, the crunch of her boots on the frozen concrete floor the only sound in the universe. She reached out a gloved hand and touched one of the containers. It was so cold it felt like it was burning her skin, even through the thick material. She selected one at random and, with Silas's help, carried it back toward the vault door where the air was marginally warmer. The container had a simple latch mechanism. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and anticipation, fumbled with it. Finally, it clicked open. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like dry, inert foam, was a small, clear packet. And inside the packet, like jewels on display, were seeds. They were tiny, dark, and unremarkable, but she recognized them from a picture in one of Alistair's botany books. The seeds of an heirloom tomato variety that had been declared extinct in the wild a decade ago, a victim of commercial hybridization and climate change. She picked up another container and another. One held the seeds of a rare, drought-resistant strain of wheat from the Fertile Crescent. Another held the kernels of a blue corn that had been sacred to a tribe that no longer existed. It was a seed bank, a genetic Noah's Ark. Alistair hadn't been preserving his final catch of fish. He had been preserving the genetic heritage of the planet's flora. He had been saving the very foundation of the food chain from the great failure of stewardship he had so feared. The scale of it was staggering. The sheer, obsessive dedication it must have taken left her breathless. This was not the work of a madman. It was the work of a visionary, a man who had looked into the future and had taken tangible, monumental steps to protect it. "The winter of the world," Silas murmured, his voice filled with a profound awe. He was ready for it. But that wasn't all. As they ventured deeper into the vault, following the layout on the blueprints, they came to a second, smaller chamber, sealed by another, less formidable door. This one was marked with a single word, one, quote 67 one. Inside this room, the temperature was still frigid, but not to the same cryo-level degree. Instead of shelves of seeds, this chamber was lined with rows of reinforced fireproof filing cabinets and heavy safes. This was the administrative heart of Alistair's operation. Using a set of keys she had found in his desk, Sarah began to open them. The first cabinets were filled with research, decades of it, meticulous data on climate change, soil degradation, water scarcity, and corporate agricultural practices. There were scientific papers, news clippings, and Alistair's own handwritten analyses. It was a library of impending doom, a detailed, evidence-based argument for why the seed vault was not an act of paranoia, but of radical necessary foresight. Then she opened the safes. The contents of the first one made her gasp. It was filled with cash, neat, plastic-wrapped bundles of $100 bills. More money than she had ever seen in her life. A quick count suggested it was actually $1 million in liquid currency for immediate operational expenses, A handwritten note on top read, "Press no banks." The next safe was even more shocking. It did not contain but financial instruments of a far greater value. Bearer bonds from the pre-digital era issued by stable blue-chip corporations worth tens of millions of dollars. Stock certificates for companies that had since become giants of industry. Deeds to parcels of land in places that were now prime real estate. It was a portfolio of old money, carefully curated and preserved, growing in value silently and anonymously for half a century. And in the final, largest safe, they found the ledgers, dozens of them. In his same spidery script, Alistair had tracked every transaction, every investment, every dividend. He had been a brilliant, patient investor, playing the long game, turning a modest family inheritance into a colossal fortune. He had used the cannery as a shell, a front for his true work, which was not just preservation, but also accumulation. He was building a war chest. At the back of the final ledger, on a single separate sheet of paper, was the summary, a conservative, up-to-date valuation of all the assets, the cash, the bonds, the stocks, the real estate. Sarah's eyes scanned the figures, her mind struggling to process the number of zeros. The bottom line was written in red ink and underlined twice. Total net worth, $467 million. The number was so vast, so astronomical, it felt meaningless. She sank to the floor, the ledger sliding from her numb fingers. All of it. It was all hers. The eviction notice, the desperate bus ride, the nights spent worrying about how to afford medicine for her son. It all seemed like a story from someone else's life. With this, she could go anywhere, do anything. She could buy a penthouse in New York, a villa in France. She could give Leo the world, the best schools, the best doctors, a life of absolute and unshakable security. The relief was so immense it was physically painful, a crushing weight lifting from her soul. She started to laugh, a sound that was half a sob. She was rich, unimaginably, life-alteringly rich. Silas stood silently by the door watching her, his expression a mixture of wonder and something else, something she couldn't quite read, concern. He looked from the ledgers in her hand to the door of the seed vault, and then back to her. He didn't say a word, but his silence was a question. What now? The discovery of the money was a blinding sunrise, a sudden brilliant light that erased all the shadows of her past life. For a few euphoric hours, that was all she could see. The solution, the end of all her problems. The world had opened up before her, a vista of infinite possibilities, all purchased and paid for by a dead man's prescient genius. She was free. The euphoria of the discovery was a powerful, intoxicating drug. For the first time in her adult life, the crushing weight of financial insecurity was gone, replaced by a sense of boundless freedom. Sarah walked through the next day in a daze, the number echoing in her mind, 467 million. It was a shield against all the world's hardships. She imagined a new life for herself and Leo, a life of warmth and ease, far from the brutal cold of the Arctic and the ghosts of the Cannery. She pictured a sun-drenched house with a yard, Leo laughing on a swing set, his cheeks rosy with health, not fever. She saw a future with no landlords, no eviction notices, no desperate rationing of cheap food. The money was an answer to a prayer she had been too exhausted to even whisper. But as the initial shock began to fade, a new, more complex set of emotions began to surface. It started as a faint, dissonant hum beneath the triumphant symphony of her relief, a quiet unease that she couldn't immediately place. It was in the way Silas looked at her, his usual quiet warmth now tinged with a watchful reservation. It was in the weight of the leather-bound journals on the desk, their pages filled with a dead man's fierce, uncompromising purpose. She found herself standing before the open vault, the impossibly cold air breathing out of its dark maw. She looked past the, quote, 71 room, with its promise of personal salvation, and into the main chamber, at the silent, ordered rows of seeds. Each small container was a promise, a potential forest, a future harvest, a lifeline for a world that might one day desperately need it. Alistair hadn't accumulated a fortune for its own sake. The money wasn't the treasure, it was the fuel. It was the means to protect the real treasure. The ledgers were in a safe labeled, quote, 72, quote, and she began to understand why. An anchor is not the ship, it is the thing that holds the ship fast against the storm. The money was meant to secure the project, to fund its defense, to ensure its perpetuity. It was never meant to be a golden parachute for a single heir. The moral weight of this realization began to settle upon her. She held two inheritances in her hands. One was a life of unimaginable personal wealth and comfort. The other was a sacred, monumental responsibility. And she was beginning to understand that she could not have both. To take the money for herself would be to betray the entire purpose of Alistair's existence. It would mean abandoning the vault, leaving the seeds to whatever fate might befall them. It would mean selling the land to Marcus Thorne and Arctic Sea Holdings, the very corporate vultures Alistair had spent his life fighting against. They would demolish the cannery, and with it, the Ark. They would likely never even know what they were destroying. It would be a quiet, unobserved extinction, a final, bitter irony. This was the dilemma. Her personal freedom versus a legacy she was only just beginning to comprehend. Leo's immediate, comfortable future versus the potential future of countless unknown others. How could she possibly choose? How could she turn her back on the money that could solve every problem she'd ever had? How could she justify to her son, who had known nothing but poverty, that she was walking away from a fortune to protect a collection of frozen seeds? It felt like an impossible choice, a test designed by a philosopher. One evening, she sat with Silas by the pot-bellied stove, the wind howling outside. She finally gave voice to the conflict that was tearing her apart. "It's enough money to change everything," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I could give Leo the life I never had. A safe life." Silas was quiet for a long time, feeding a piece of driftwood into the stove, the flames illuminating the deep lines on his face. "Safety is a strange thing," he said finally. "A warm house is safe from the cold. But what is a warm house in a world with no food?" Alistair did not believe in small safety. He was building a bigger boat. He looked at her, his eyes kind but unyielding. "He did not leave you money, Sarah. He left you a choice. He tested you. He died not knowing if he had chosen his heir well. He trusted that his blood would understand the difference between wealth and worth." His words didn't solve her dilemma, but they framed it in a new, starker light. This wasn't a windfall, it was a trial. Alistair hadn't just handed her a gift, he had handed her a burden and the tools to carry it. The conflict raged within her, the part of her that was a desperate mother, the part that had endured homelessness and hunger, screamed at her to take the money and run. To save herself and her child, it was the logical, rational thing to do. Any sane person would. But another part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, was stirring. It was the part of her that had felt a surge of pride in fixing the generator, the part that had stood up to Thorne, the part that felt a sense of profound awe in the silent frozen vault. This part of her recognized the profound nobility of Alistair's mission. It understood that some things were more important than personal comfort. It was a choice between the life she wanted and the person she wanted to be. One night, unable to sleep, she walked back down to the vault. Leo was asleep upstairs, safe and warm. She stood in the freezing darkness of the seed bank, her flashlight beam playing over the endless rows of containers. She thought about the world outside this remote, frozen fortress. A world of convenience and consumption. A world that was, as Alistair had written, quote, 79, quote. She was holding the seed corn. The decision she made would echo for generations. It was a legacy, not of money, but of consequence. Standing there in the profound and sacred silence, she felt the scales inside her finally tip. The weight of the seeds, the potential life they held, had become heavier than the weight of the gold. The choice was made not in a moment of grand revelation, but in a quiet, solemn acceptance. The money was not hers, it belonged to the future. Marcus Thorne did not wait for her to call. A week after her discovery of the vault, the black helicopter returned, a menacing dragonfly against the pale Arctic sky. This time, Thorne was not alone. He was accompanied by two other men in dark, expensive suits who looked even more out of place than he did. They were lawyers, their briefcases filled with the finely crafted weapons of their trade, injunctions, subpoenas, and motions. They found Sarah not in the small office, but on the windswept loading dock, staring out at the frozen sea. She had been waiting for them. Quote 80, Thorne began, dispensing with any pretense of courtesy. Quote 81, it was a lie, a legal fiction. She knew from Alistair's papers that the taxes were paid up for the next 5 years, handled by a trust he had established long ago. Thorne was trying to bully her, to intimidate her with a language of power she was not supposed to understand. The taxes are paid, she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying over the wind. She did not raise it. She simply let the fact of it stand on its own. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He had expected a frightened, impoverished single mother, not this composed, resolute woman. He had underestimated her. That's a matter for the courts to decide, one of the lawyers interjected smoothly. However, there is another, more pressing matter. We have concerns about the welfare of your child. Sarah's blood ran cold. He is living in a derelict, unheated, unsafe industrial site. You have no stable income. You have pulled him from school. We have a moral and indeed a legal obligation to report this to the Office of Children's Services. They will likely find you to be an unfit guardian, Ms. Jenkins. Your son will be placed in foster care. It was a declaration of total war. They were not just trying to take the cannery, they were trying to take her son, to break her spirit by threatening the one thing she held more precious than anything else in the world. Fear, sharp and blinding, pierced the armor of her newfound resolve. She could fight for the cannery, for a legacy, but the thought of losing Leo, it was unbearable. This was the temptation she had not foreseen. It was not the lure of wealth, but the threat of absolute loss. Thorne saw the fear in her eyes and pressed his advantage. There is a simple way to avoid all of this unpleasantness, he said, his voice softening into a predatory purr. Sign the property over to us. We will give you a severance, enough to relocate, to find a nice apartment, to get back on your feet. Your son stays with you. Everyone wins. It was a masterful, cruel move. They were using her love for her son as a weapon against her. For a moment, she wavered. The fight seemed impossible. They were a multinational corporation with an army of lawyers. She was one woman in a frozen wasteland. Who would believe her there'd be her? Who would help her? The community in Point Hope was small and tight-knit, but they were also pragmatic. Many of them worked directly or indirectly for companies like Arctic Sea Holdings. They saw the cannery as a ruin and her as an eccentric outsider, just like her uncle. Silas was her only true ally, and he was just one old man. She was utterly alone. That night was the longest of her life. She sat by Leo's bedside, watching the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. He was healthy. He was happy here. He loved this strange, cold kingdom. But what if they took him away? The thought was a physical pain. She could end the threat right now. One signature. She could sacrifice the legacy to save her son. Wasn't that what a mother was supposed to do? But then she looked at the journals on her desk. She thought of Alistair, writing alone in this room for years, fighting his quiet, lonely battle. He had faced down these same forces, these same men in suits, and he had not broken. He had built a fortress not just of concrete and steel, but of legal and financial foresight. He must have anticipated this too. She spent the rest of the night not in despair, but in study. She went back to the, quote, 88 room, not for the ledgers of wealth, but for the cabinets filled with legal documents. She searched for Alistair's will, for the trust documents, for anything that could serve as a shield. And she found it. Tucked away in a file labeled contingency, she found a thick legal document. It was the founding charter for the Alistair Finch Preservation Trust. It was a meticulously crafted document prepared by a top environmental law firm in Seattle years ago. It legally designated the cannery and all its assets, the land, the buildings, the financial portfolio, and the contents of the vault, as the property of a charitable trust. The trust's sole legally binding mandate was the preservation and study of the seed bank for the benefit of humanity. The document named her Sarah Marie Jenkins, not as the heir, but as the sole trustee. To accept the position, she had to formally sign an affidavit renouncing all personal claim to the financial assets. The money would belong to the trust, to be managed by her for its stated purpose. It was Alistair's masterstroke. He had separated the wealth from the individual. By making it a charitable trust, he had placed it under a different set of legal protections, shielding it from corporate predators and inheritance taxes. It was an ironclad defense, but it came at a price. By signing it, she would be formally and irrevocably walking away from the $467 million. She would be choosing the responsibility over the reward. She would be committing herself, and by extension, her son, to this place, to this fight, for the foreseeable future. There would be no sun-drenched house, no life of easy comfort. There would only be the cold, the wind, and the weight of the legacy. The lawyers would still come. The threats against her custody of Leo would still be real. But with the trust activated, she would not be fighting as a private individual. She would be fighting as the head of a foundation with all the legal and financial power that entailed. She held the pen over the signature line for a long time. The morning light, pale and thin, was beginning to filter through the office window. She looked at Leo sleeping peacefully, and she knew what she had to do. A mother's job wasn't just to give her child a safe life. It was to show him what a life of purpose and integrity looked like. She would not teach her son to run from bullies. She would teach him to stand his ground. With a steady hand, she signed her name, Sarah Marie Jenkins, trustee. The signature was not an act of sacrifice. It was an act of liberation. She had finally and fully accepted her inheritance. The signing of the trust document was a quiet declaration of war, an act of defiance that shifted the very ground beneath the conflict. Sarah was no longer an impoverished woman squatting on a valuable piece of land. She was the director of a legally constituted charitable foundation, armed with a clear mandate and, though Thorne didn't know it yet, immense financial resources. Her transformation was palpable. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her were replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. She was no longer just protecting a building. She was defending a future. Her first act as trustee was to travel back to Anchorage. She left Leo in the care of Silas and his wife, a warm, kind woman who enveloped the boy in a grandmotherly embrace. The journey this time was different. She was not a refugee fleeing poverty, but a leader on a mission. In Anchorage, she didn't go to the library to stay warm. She went to find the best lawyer in the city. Using a small portion of the liquid cash from the vault, she retained the services of a formidable, silver-haired attorney named Evelyn Reed, a woman known for taking on corporate giants and winning. In Reed's plush office overlooking the snow-dusted mountains, Sarah laid out the entire story: the inheritance, the journals, the vault, the seeds, the money, and Thorne's threats. She presented the signed trust documents. Evelyn Reed listened, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to fascinated disbelief, and finally to a fierce, steely-eyed admiration. Quote 91, Reed said, a slow smile spreading across her face. Quote 92, the next move was not defensive, but offensive. Reed filed a preemptive lawsuit against Arctic Sea Holdings, accusing them of harassment, corporate intimidation, and attempting to defraud a charitable trust. She simultaneously filed a petition with the court for a protective order, documenting Thorne's threats regarding Leo's custody as an act of malicious coercion. They didn't stop there. They went public. Sarah, guided by Reed, agreed to a single, exclusive interview with a respected national journalist who had a reputation for in-depth environmental reporting. She told her story not as a victim, but as a guardian. She spoke of her great-uncle's vision, of the looming ecological crisis he had foreseen, and of the incredible living library of genetic diversity hidden beneath the Alaskan permafrost. She revealed the existence of the seed bank, quote 93, quote, as the journalist dramatically dubbed it. The story was a bombshell. It was picked up by news outlets around the world. The narrative was irresistible. A homeless single mother inheriting not just a fortune, but a sacred duty to protect a genetic treasure trove from a rapacious corporation. The Cannery was no longer a derelict building. It became a symbol of hope and foresight. Sarah Jenkins was no longer an anonymous woman. She became a figure of moral strength, an unlikely hero for a world anxious about its future. The public outcry against Arctic Sea Holdings was swift and brutal. Environmental groups rallied to her cause. Scientists and agriculturalists from leading universities voiced their support, validating the immense scientific value of the seed bank. The corporation's stock price took a hit. Thorne and his lawyers, who had intended to wage their war in the quiet, sterile corridors of a family court, now found themselves fighting a public relations nightmare on a global stage. The custody threat evaporated overnight. The Office of Children's Services, now aware of the context and Sarah's newfound resources, quietly closed their file. Thorne had tried to use her poverty as a weapon, but she had turned it into a shield, a symbol of her integrity. When Thorne was finally forced to respond, he appeared on television, looking flustered and defensive. He dismissed the seed bank as a, quote, 94 and portrayed Sarah as a naive woman being manipulated by environmental extremists. But the damage was done. His credibility was shattered. He was no longer the powerful corporate raider. He was the villain in a story that had captured the world's imagination. Sarah watched his interview from the small office in the Cannery, which was now starting to feel more and more like a home. She felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. She only felt a quiet, profound sense of vindication. She had honored Alistair's legacy. She had met the enemy on the battlefield he had chosen, and she had won. The legal battle would drag on for months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Arctic Sea Holdings eventually withdrew their claim, issuing a terse public statement about, quote, 95 Marcus Thorne was quietly reassigned to a different continent. They had not been defeated by lawyers or by money, but by the power of a story of a promise kept. During this time, Sarah's own evolution continued. She was no longer just a mother and a survivor. She was a leader. She immersed herself in her new role as trustee. She used the trust funds to begin the slow, careful process of restoring the cannery, not as a factory for fish, but as a world-class research facility. She hired engineers to upgrade the vault's power systems, ensuring its stability for the next century. She began to assemble a board of scientific advisors, experts in botany, genetics, and agriculture, to help her manage the collection. She was building the future Alistair had envisioned. Leo thrived. He saw his mother not as a victim, but as a powerful, capable woman respected by the people around her. The cannery was his home, and the vast, wild landscape of the Arctic was his backyard. He learned the names of the seabirds from Silas and helped Sarah label seed containers in the vault. He was growing up at the center of a place of immense importance, his childhood shaped not by what they lacked, but by the purpose they served. One afternoon, Sarah stood on the same loading dock where she had faced Thorne. The wind was just as cold, the sea just as vast and frozen. But everything had changed. She was no longer a prisoner of this place, but its steward. She had been given a choice between a life of comfort and a life of meaning, and she had chosen meaning. The inheritance she finally understood was never the money. It was not even the seeds. The true inheritance was the choice itself, the opportunity to become the person she was meant to be. The end of the legal battle with Arctic Sea Holdings was not an ending, but a beginning. The global attention that had been their shield during the fight now became a beacon, drawing a new kind of visitor to the remote shores of Point Hope. They came not in helicopters with lawyers, but in small charter planes and on research vessels, their faces filled with curiosity and hope. They were scientists, botanists, agronomists, and students from around the world, drawn by the legend of, quote, 96, quote, the cannery, once a monument to decay, began to stir with a new kind of life. Sarah, with the guidance of her newly formed advisory board, oversaw its transformation. The vast, empty processing floor, where fish had once been gutted and packed, was converted into a state-of-the-art laboratory and research center. The rusted machinery was removed, replaced by gleaming stainless steel workstations, climate-controlled germination chambers, and powerful microscopes. The liquid assets from the, quote, 97 vault were carefully reinvested into a diversified, ethical portfolio designed to generate a steady, perpetual income for the foundation's operating costs. Sarah proved to be as shrewd and patient an investor as her great-uncle, guided by his core principle, play the long game. The foundation's mission was twofold. First and foremost was the guardianship of the seed vault, the, quote, 98, quote, as Alistair had called it. A small, dedicated team of geneticists and archivists was hired to catalog, test, and maintain the vast collection. They discovered that Alistair's work was even more significant than they had imagined. He had collected not just rare and extinct species, but also genetically diverse land races, traditional crop varieties developed by indigenous farmers over centuries, each one uniquely adapted to its local environment. These seeds, which were being wiped out by the global spread of monoculture farming, held the genetic keys to drought resistance, pest resilience, and nutritional diversity. They were a priceless resource for a future world facing the challenges of a changing climate. The second part of the mission was education and outreach. Sarah believed that the Ark should not be a sealed tomb, but a living library. The foundation established fellowships for young scientists, sponsored research into sustainable agriculture, and began working with indigenous communities around the world to preserve their own agricultural heritage. The small office where she and Leo had first huddled for warmth became the administrative heart of a global operation. Sarah never moved into a larger, more comfortable home. She and Leo continued to live in that Spartan space, a daily reminder of where they had come from and the purpose that now guided them. Her life was not one of luxury, but of profound fulfillment. She was no longer defined by her poverty or her struggles, but by her work. She became a respected voice in the global conservation community, known for her quiet determination and her unwavering moral clarity. She never lost the humility that her past had forged in her. She managed a multi-million-dollar foundation, but still mended Leo's clothes by hand and found joy in a simple meal shared with Silas and his family. Leo grew up in this unique environment, a child of two worlds. He had the vast, wild freedom of the Arctic and access to some of the most brilliant scientific minds of his generation. He was equally comfortable navigating the sea ice with Silas and discussing genetic sequencing with a visiting professor from Cambridge. He grew into a thoughtful, intelligent young man who understood the weight of his family's legacy not as a burden, but as a privilege. The unseen forces, the corporate and political interests that Alistair had railed against, did not simply disappear. They were always there, circling on the horizon, waiting for a moment of weakness. Other corporations probed for legal loopholes. Governments, citing national security, sometimes made inquiries about the vault's contents. The fight was never truly over. But Sarah and the Foundation were no longer a lone woman in a crumbling building. They were a global institution, a fortress built not just of concrete, but of law, science, and public goodwill. One clear, cold evening, years after she had first arrived, Sarah stood on the dock with Leo, now a teenager. The sky was ablaze with the ethereal, shifting curtains of the aurora borealis. The lights danced across the sky, painting the snow and the sea in silent, impossible colors. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the celestial display. "Do you ever miss it?" Leo asked, his voice now a deep baritone. "The other life, the one we could have had." Sarah looked at her son, his face illuminated in the green and violet light, and she saw in him the best of her, the best of Alistair, the best of the legacy they were building. She thought of the eviction notice, the fever, the desperation. She thought of the number, 467 million, and the sun-drenched house she had once dreamed of. The dream felt hollow now, a ghost of a desire that belonged to a different person. "No," she said, her voice soft but certain. "That wasn't a life. That was an escape. This," she said, gesturing not at the cannery or the vault, but at the vast, beautiful, and demanding world around them. "This is a life." The inheritance had not been a sum of money that could be spent. It was a purpose that had to be earned day after day in the cold, clear air at the edge of the world. And in choosing to serve it, Sarah Jenkins, the homeless single mother, had become one of the wealthiest people on earth, not in dollars, but in worth. The fight would continue. The winter Alistair had foreseen was still coming, but here, in this remote fortress of hope, the seeds of a new spring were being kept safe.